Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first webinar in our webinar series in preparation for COP27. ECES started the effort of preparing for COP27 and also bringing out loud and clear the voice of Africa. We started with a conference that took place in March. We started the process and we're continuing. Of key importance for us is this series of webinars. This is only the first one of them. Each one is focusing on a specific topic. And the material that's going to be out of those webinars is going to be presented at least in the blue zone part of the conference with the Egyptian presidency, but also everything that we do is going to be presented in a compact two-pager, very specific, with recommendations that will be passed on not only to the presidency but also to our African delegates in the official discussions, hopefully to try and make a difference as much as possible. Okay, I want to welcome our guests. We have 6 very distinguished speakers. I'm very proud to have them, very glad to have them on board. Let me start with the only lady in the group. Okay, ladies need to be spoiled, ladies first. I think we all agree on that. And even if you don't, I will go with her anyway. It makes no difference, really. All right, so we have here Mrs. Herry Cho, who is actually, I had the pleasure of meeting her in a previous event lately. Lovely lady at every level. She's the managing director, head of sustainability and sustainable finance. She's in the steering group of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, member of the task force for nature-related finance disclosure, and is on the management advisory board of the National University of Singapore Sustainable and Green Finance Institute, plus a bunch of very distinguished positions. You all have the CVs. I'm just indicating some of the key areas. Okay, I proceed to Dr. Kanina Kariuki. He is the vice president. Pleasure to have you, sir. He's the vice president for power, energy, climate, and green growth at the African Development Bank Group. Dr. Kevin is currently the vice president, as I already said. He is chartered electrical engineer with over 30 years of experience in power system development, renewable energy development, and energy efficiency, climate change and green growth, strategic energy partnerships, energy financial solutions. Previously, he assumed various esteemed positions, including head of infrastructure at Industrial Promotion Services, Kenya, head of the technical division of the Kenya Electricity Regulatory Board, and others. He holds a PhD in the reliability of power systems and MSc in electrical power engineering from the University of Manchester Institute of Science and Technology. Very glad to have you. Dr. Malay Fofana. He is the director. Hello. He's the director for Africa and head of programs at the Global Green Growth Institute. Previously, he was the country director for Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire. He has participated in over 100 projects across various key sectors in Africa, working for the largest donors as well as the private sector. And he has more than 18 years of professional experience in the development sector. He's from Senegal. He's Senegalese national and recognized in 2020 as the best African promoter of green economy. Okay, it's a pleasure to have you. We have Mr. Uche Orji. I don't know if he's already in or not. Maybe I'll leave him to the end because I'm not sure.
Yes, I am.
Oh, you are. Hi. Hi. Mr. Orji is the Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer at Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority. He's having served in this capacity since its inception. He brings over 3 decades of global experience spanning banking, asset management, and financial services to the leadership of the authority, and he serves on the boards of the Infrastructure Credit Guarantee Company, Development Bank of Nigeria, Family Homes Funds, etc., etc. It's a pleasure and great to have you. We have Mr. Andrew Ali. He's the Senior Advisor, Southbridge Group. Mr. Ali is currently Senior Advisor, Southbridge Group, a Pan-African investment bank and an angel investor since 2009, supporting many well-known startups in their early stages of growth. Previously, he was President and CEO of the Africa Finance Corporation, which he led for 10 years. He's an accomplished business leader and institute builder with 35 years of experience, of which 25 years has been investing and managing businesses in Africa. So we have very deep knowledge of the continent. And then finally, we have Mr. Ahmed Hassan from Egypt, consulting team leader of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Engineer Ahmed Hassan has an assortment of experiences related to transitioning markets towards cleaner energy sources and reducing harmful emissions. Previously, he was Green Tourism Advisor to the Minister of Tourism and Energy Efficiency Policy Advisor to the Supreme Energy Council, and he holds a master's degree in architecture with a focus on green buildings from UCLA. Okay, it's a pleasure to have you all. I hope, I don't know if the Minister of the Environment, Dr. Yasmine Fouad, Her Excellency Dr. Yasmine Fouad, is very interested in our webinars and is joining in. I hope she's in already. I'm not sure. I'm searching for the name. She's in already, Dr. Yasmine. I don't think she's in, but we are going to start, and the minute she's in, she's going to join us because because of time sensitivity. Just a second, please.
Connected. You can just start Dr. Abla and attend 15 minutes online. You can just start
Okay, she just sent me a message saying she's going to be in 15 minutes, and she's asking us to start, which we're going to do anyway, because for time consideration. Okay, it's very important. All right, let us start. We have a very interesting topic. This is the first in our webinar series, and the idea is to brainstorm the topics that are of relevance to the climate finance, and brainstorm them deeply, so that we come up with specific mechanisms and specific solutions to existing problems and come up with innovative ideas. So the talk is not about talking about the importance of the topic. We already know it is important. The question is how to go about whatever obstacles, how to come up with new ideas. And I think I'm going to start. I'm going to go by topic more than going by actual names, okay, if you allow me. So I'm going to start with the issue of the existing green fund, okay? And I would like to start with Dr. Kevin, okay? Climate finance is the thing that you are living in day and night, I suppose. It's part of the job and general interest. And there seems to be access to finance for anything that's related to green and environment, and yet it's not happening, or it's not being used by anybody properly. Why is this the case? Okay, and what can be done to get over it? And the perception of the African Development Bank and your personal perception as well, please.
Thank you very much, Abla, first of all, for having me on this session, which is organized by the Egyptian Center for Economic Studies, ECES in abbreviation. So basically, the way I've organized my thought process is that I'll provide an overview which involves, I'll provide a context and background of this particular subject. Then I'll talk about why the extent of need for climate finance, and why there is limited, actually very limited access to climate finance in Africa. And finally, I'll talk about how we can increase access to climate finance in Africa. So that's the way I've sort of organized my thought process. Okay. But to provide context and background, Abla, what you may not, I'm sure you know, a lot of people on this webinar will be aware of the fact that Africa is a tiny emitter of historical anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. To be precise, it's actually less than 3% of global historical greenhouse gas emissions. And yet, Africa bears the brunt of climate change impacts. And to sort of drive this home, 9 out of 10 and 35 out of 45 most vulnerable countries to climate change in the world are in Africa, with agriculture as the most exposed sector because we rely a lot on rainfall. And as a result, it is projected that climate change will reduce yields of Africa's rain-fed staple crops by between 8 to 22% over the next 20 years. And 20 years is important because we understand the latest Global Center on Adaptation indicates that Africa's climate change is locked in for 20 years. So irrespective of what we do, we will see these impacts over the next 20 years. So how does this manifest? I mean, I'm sure the images of the 2019 cyclones Idai, Kenneth, and Kenneth in Mozambique, Malawi, Zimbabwe are still fresh in most of our minds, and their impacts continue to hurt those economies. Just to be precise, the cyclones affected about 3 million people, 50 of whom were children, and caused 1,000 deaths, damaging infrastructure estimated at 2.8 billion and destroying more than 1 million acres of cropland and 100,000 homes. Unfortunately, it didn't stop there. And the predicted increase in frequency and severity of adverse events is coming to pass, as evidenced by the cyclones Anna and Bastirai, which visited Southern Africa this year, causing more deaths and further damage, including to infrastructure. So coming to the need for climate finance, according to the African Economic Outlook, which is a publication by our bank, the continent loses between 5% and 15% of its GDP to climate change impacts. Hence, Africa already incurs $7 to $15 billion per year due to climate change, and which IMF projects could rise to $50 billion per year by 2030. And even this is a tiny amount of the projected of Africa's projected climate finance needs, which again, according to the African Economic Outlook, which we released in May this year, is estimated at $127 billion per year through 2030. That's the one side of things, that's the need side of it. Yet Africa only receives 3% of global climate finance flows, which in 2020 equated to only $19 billion. Okay, that is for sub-Saharan Africa. It may be slightly higher if the Northern African portion is disaggregated from the 2.5 billion allocated to Middle East and North Africa, but still very small nevertheless. Compare this. East Asia and the Pacific, mostly China and Japan, accounted for 47% of global climate finance in 2020, which amounts to $296 billion. So then, despite this skewness, why the limited access to climate finance in Africa? I think this is important. Among the reasons cited for the limited access to climate finance in Africa includes, number one, the global climate finance architecture, which is complex, resource-intensive, and prioritizes, this is very important, it prioritizes mitigation, which receives about 90% of the available climate finance. In contrast, adaptation and resilience, which, considering the worsening climate change impacts on Africa, and indeed in developing countries, which is the primary concern, only accounts for 10%. That's one of the reasons of the limited access to climate finance in Africa. Secondly, we have weak absorption and limited implementation capacity among governments, which leads to inability to develop bankable adaptation and mitigation projects. The problem is particularly acute in adaptation projects, which are considered commercially unattractive, as the methodology for quantifying and ascribing value to adaptation benefits is at early stage of development. The third reason for limited access is the limited coordination among relevant agencies and national designated authorities for climate funds, For example, you'll find that the entity that is involved in mobilizing climate finance lies maybe in the Ministry of Environment, why in actual fact, it should be in the Ministry of Finance. So there needs to be coordination, very good coordination between the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Environment. Then we all know this, and although it's rarely spoken about, there is lack of prioritization of climate finance in national development plans. This is in the light of competing development needs amidst widening fiscal deficits and post-COVID-19 recovery efforts. Moreover, and this is a reality, there is urgency to finance frequent climate-related disasters as opposed to financing for adaptation. Further, there are limited incentives to promote green technologies and attract private climate finance, particularly to support adaptation and resilience. So how do we increase access to climate finance? I think this is the crux of today's session. In my view, concerted efforts must be made to increase access to climate finance in Africa. In this regard, commitment regarding the plan by developed nations to deliver the famous, or infamous if you want to call it that way, $100 billion goal urgently and through 2025, as well as pledges made by many developed countries to increase the provision of climate finance to support adaptation in developed countries are imperative. However, and this is my personal view, I believe there must be some form of affirmative action in favor of Africa by the global community, considering the minute contribution to the problem and the disproportionate impact on climate change on Africa. I think that might be necessary. And this is why, at the bank, we have proposed the establishment of a $13 billion climate action window for 2023 to 2025, which is going to be in parallel with the 16th replenishment of the African Development Fund, which is our conceptual window, to provide dedicated resources for climate action. And in this particular case, 63% of the resources will be dedicated to adaptation. Further, the 32% of those resources, if they materialize, will be earmarked for mitigation, while 5% will be dedicated to technical assistance to attend to policy support and institutional capacity building with a view to creating the enabling environment required to catalyze investment in climate action and increase access to finance, including through the private sector. In other words, addressing the obstacles that curtail access to climate, which I mentioned slightly earlier. Other avenues that could be used to access climate finance, and this is unique at the bank, is what we call the adaptation benefits mechanism, which we have designed as a credible and transparent mechanism through which donors, corporations, and ultimately consumers can contribute towards the cost of adapting to climate change. Payments for adaptation projects developers are made in return for certified adaptation benefits, which will help to make adaptation projects financially attractive, especially to the private sector. At the same time, the purchasers can use the certified adaptation benefits to report in a transparent manner to support given genuine adaptation needs in developing countries. ABM, as we call it, was adopted as a non-market tool for settlement of verifiable adaptation benefits and referenced in Article 6.8 of the Paris Agreement. The other things that we can think about is deploying innovative climate finance instruments to mobilize domestic climate finance in Africa. In this regard, green bonds and loans, sustainability or sustainability-linked bonds and loans, as well as debt for climate swaps and more efficient and better priced carbon markets could be important sources of climate finance. Again, countries can also mobilize domestic capital through carbon markets, especially when emissions are traded at true price of carbon. Other innovative climate finance instruments could include realignment of fossil fuel subsidies and other progressive tax instruments deployable in key sectors such as energy and transport. Finally, could, and this is a question I'm posing because it's a bit slightly more complicated, could special drawing rights allocated to willing developed countries be allocated to African countries through prescribed holders, such as the African Development Bank Group, to finance climate resilient development and just energy transitions in Africa? I'll stop there with that particular question, Abla. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much, Kevin. Thank you for the specific suggestions and for the introduction on the problem, and definitely it's the $100 billion thing is infamous. Okay, not famous. It is infamous, and definitely there is a lot of focus on mitigation versus adaptation and resilience, which we need a lot more in Africa. So this is excellent. I would like before I ask for comments from the other speakers. To add to the same topic, I want to introduce Her Excellency, Dr. Yasmine Fouad, our Minister of the Environment, who joined us actually from the beginning. So she heard everything you said, Dr. Kevin, and I welcome you and thank you so much for encouraging what we're doing and for taking it actually very, very seriously. I do appreciate that very much, and we all do. And please, you have the speech for a few minutes. I know your time is not that much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Abla. Good morning, everyone, colleagues and friends. And as Dr. Abla has mentioned, I really enjoyed hearing Dr. Kevin in his intervention for setting the scene. I'd like at the outset to thank ECES and the CIB for convening and taking the initiative to convene that set of webinars for the sake of the African continent and to have more ongoing discussion on the road towards COP27. I'll be giving some remarks with two views here, with the views in my capacity as being the COP27 Ministerial Coordinator and Envoy, as well as in my other capacity at the national level as the Minister of Environment for the Arab Republic of Egypt. But the discussion is really very interesting. If Dr. Abla can allow me just for 10 minutes, I'm very interested to continue really having that interactive discussion. This morning we had our first regional economic commission in Addis was convened by by Egypt COP27 climate champion, Dr. Mahmoud Mohiuddin, and our colleagues from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as other ministers. And the discussion was really very interesting when you come to talk about climate finance and the priorities for adaptation. But let me try to give three sets or three pillars for that discussion that would help us to be more focused for Africa. Number one, which are the challenges for climate finance in general and why Africa was not able to achieve that climate finance, whether we're talking about mitigation or adaptation. Second, what would be the priorities if we're talking about a more resilient continent? And here we're talking about financing adaptation, and I'll give some remarks on what Dr. Kevin has mentioned in that regard, and some food for thought maybe for the upcoming discussion. And third, where would be the solutions and the mechanisms that we would like to see Africa moving forward with that. For the first one on the climate finance, the challenges are very clear to everyone. They have been discussed in different COPs starting from 2015 in the Paris Agreement up to Glasgow. Those challenges would simply meaning the limited climate finance, but even if they're not limited, there is a challenge for accessing those finance. And accessing climate finance would have two faults. The first one related to the process itself of the financial mechanisms that should serve the Paris Agreement, and what are the procedures for attaining that or for getting those kind of funds. And another one related to what Dr. Kevin mentioned, which is the limited capacity within Africa in order to present their needs and their proposal with a more climate rationale. Given also a very important factor here when we're talking about adaptation, that there's no global goal for adaptation. There's no definition for that. I didn't even enter into the bankability of the adaptation projects. But as long as you cannot define something, you cannot measure it. And as long as you cannot measure it, you cannot go through all the journey that you would like to go through. And from that perspective, and the third problem that happened is the different global challenges that the world is facing that give and put more burden on Africa. When we're talking about the pandemic, when we're talking about the economic crisis, and even when we're talking about various global environmental challenges. Unfortunately, we ourselves had done a very great harm to ourselves when we de-linked the global environmental challenges. When we started discussing the biodiversity and the land degradation and the climate away from each other, while they were actually born and combined to be together. And that's the reason maybe President Abdel el-Sisi in 2018 has called for the synergetic approach of linking climate, land degradation, and biodiversity, not only because of the financial resources are rigid, but because simply we cannot deal and handle one challenge without looking at the other one. And this is also at the heart of why Africa was not able to go through with the climate finance. The second part that I would like to give my focus on today is adaptation and how Africa would be able to get out of the bottleneck of increasing the finance of adaptation. And that actually does not only apply to Africa, but it also applies to other developing countries, especially the SEDS and the LDCs. When we're talking about adaptation, we would come to find the challenges. First, the definition. Second, if you don't have, we have a definition for the mitigation. All the reports of the IPCC has simply given the target of we need to keep the 1.5 alive. Before that, in the Paris, we called on the 2 degrees Celsius. So at least we have a numbers, we have a methodology on how best can you calculate the greenhouse gases. But on adaptation, when we come even to present, and this is a challenge for all countries, on a project, you are being questioned what would be the climate rationale, and the climate rationale in adaptation projects are very much subjective and they're not objective. For an example, when I come to prepare a project for the watershed in Aswan, I would need to prove how many inhabitants would benefit from that project. And that would be subjective in our assessment on how much would be benefiting from that project. And the same applies for the coastal protection and for the coastal erosion. The second thing would be the bankability. How can we ensure that the adaptation projects are bankable? And here we're talking about how can we assess first the risk related to the banking sector, and secondly, how can the private sector secure its investment? When we're talking about coastal erosion or nature protection, these are mostly projects that are funded from the public funding, and Egypt had a very good example of that. When we started our plan, Egypt's Delta, as you all know, one of the very vulnerable deltas out of the 3 deltas around the world, we started to plan correctly in a way of whatever we're doing at the part related to the shore protection, we will invest our own funding. Up to 7 billion Egyptian pound has been invested by the Ministry of Water Resources and Irrigation, with an additional co-financing from the Green Climate Fund reached $34 million in order to have those nature based solutions that would protect the vulnerable community along the shore of Damietta, of Rashid, of Port Said, of Kafr al-Sheikh, and Alexandria. And by the way, that's only a pilot because this is not covering all the needs of the country. And when we're talking about another issue related to adaptation, which is food security and agriculture. Why? And that would be a question that I'd like to address to the MDB, to have that kind of interactive discussion through the excellent webinar being prepared by ECES in that regard, which is why aren't we able to make agriculture and private sector investment bankable in that part? Where would be the credit lines that would come to the small farmers to protect their crops? And how can their insurance scheme be integrated within the system in order to be able to endure the extreme weather events that happens to the farmers, whether it's an extreme heat or it's a very low temperature? That is a question that could be really answered in COP27 and would give an actual implementation on the ground in a year of 2022 where food prices are getting higher. Thirdly, the different mechanisms that we use for adaptation. I mentioned here the public funding. Where would the country put the public funding? Secondly, where would the private sector investment would go? Thirdly, where would the development partners contribute in that regard? In the private sector investment, we need to be very clear that all countries are mandated to prepare their national adaptation plans. And that's mandatory for all countries. We've received the funds. Most of the African countries were able to receive the seed fund of the $3 million for national adaptation plans. But the question here, are we going to face those countries with the fact that when you prepare your plans, you need to go and search for the funding, and guess what are their funds for the investment of those plans or those projects? This is a very critical question, because I had an intensive discussion in that with the Green Climate Fund being the largest fund for funding climate. How are you ensuring, after countries preparing their national adaptation plan with the package of technical assistance, grant and investment, that those opportunities for investment would be a low-hanging fruit? Because we cannot prepare an app in 3 years and then go to the countries and tell them, sorry, there's no funding, there's no mechanism. We cannot make adaptation projects bankable. This cannot be a discussion that takes place for sure in a COP anymore. Thirdly, the part related to adaptation, resilience, loss and damage, disaster risk reduction, all those are connected to nature and biodiversity. So again, we cannot tackle financial mechanisms for adaptation resilience away from the ecosystem-based approaches and nature-based solution. The beauty of that is that if we are going, for an example, like Kevin has mentioned, the green bonds or the debt for swap or so forth, the pitfall that we would be doing is that we overlook the issue of nature and biodiversity within that process of adaptation and resilience. I'll give a quick example of how that could be bankable. Most of the African countries rely on tourism as a big part of that, whether it's ecotourism, whether it's the forest where the private sector would benefit from that. Why don't we see that that sector, that private sector related to the tourism, could have a risk insurance mechanism that would ensure their investment, would have a credit line to turn and to shift their practices towards more climate proofing practice. And here there will be two arrows, an arrow that talk about mitigation, for example, the tourism sector, including the renewable energy, the energy efficiency and so forth. But there could be another sector related to how they can conserve better the natural resources upon which their investment is being part of that. And in that they will be spending and investing in that kind of protection of the shorelines, in the coastal zone management, in including more resilient community in that part. Finally, when Kevin was mentioning on the climate action, the adaptation benefit mechanism, still I can see that when we're talking about the climate action and only 3% of what the bank is proposing as technical assistance would not be enough if we have limited capacity in Africa. We would need to ensure 3 parallel tracks working together. A bulk of technical assistance and capacity development in Africa that would enable Africa to translate its need into actual proposal and packages for both investment and grants at the same time. Second, a pool of financial mechanism where we are collecting the success stories that happened in Africa, either at the level of the small scale, like small farmers or small fishermen, at the level of enabling environment and regulation and policy reforms, at the level of investment, like in the case of Egypt and the vast investment opportunities at the renewable energy. Collecting those stories would help shaping up that financial mechanism. Here are the things that should be done. It could be replicated and upscaled because it did prove its benefit and its success in other African neighborhood and countries. Finally, when we're talking about the carbon market, which is a very interesting topic that Kevin has mentioned among other mechanisms, Where would be, this is something that we would like to discuss further. We're happy in Glasgow that we were able to finalize Article 6, but we would like to see how can the process of the share of proceeds that would come out from Article 6 would feed into the adaptation fund for more work and more finance that would be there for the continent. I hope I was able to frame that kind of discussion and throw some food for thought that would help this discussion move forward. And once again, I would like to thank Dr. Abla and the CIB for convening that. And rest assured that Egypt is welcoming you all. We promise that we will be able to have a COP for implementation, a just and ambitious transition, but it will take us all to do that collectively and in the spirit of solidarity and collaboration to prove to the future generation that we are up to the challenge and the urgency of the matter of the climate fight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yasmine. This was extremely useful and inspiring and definitely guiding for our discussion and and telling everybody about Egypt's intention to push implementation as much as possible during our presidency for this conference. And we are interested in beyond the conference. It's not about conference, it's about beyond the conference. And this is why in our initiative from the beginning, we keep saying COP27 and beyond, because if you don't follow up on things, we haven't done anything. You mentioned, Dr. Yasmine, the topics that we're actually having in our webinars, whether we're talking about agriculture, the farmers and how they're affected and how we need to increase the resilience. The carbon market is a key issue mentioned already by Dr. Kevin and by yourself. And I'm advising the others not to talk about it explicitly because we are going to have a special session for it. So let's make sure, I mean, the more we focus we are, the better we are going to reach results. So there is going to be a webinar on the agriculture, on carbon market, and everything related to it, on the early warning system for the natural disasters, which does not exist in Egypt at this point, in Africa at this point, on the income distribution and the impact on gender and migration due to climate issues, and again, how to increase the resilience. And then finally on the adaptation plans, because each African country is different from the other. The continent is not a homogeneous continent. Countries vary significantly in their level of development. And this means challenges for the adaptation plans as well. So this is going to be a topic in its own right itself, okay? But thank you so much, Dr. Yasmine, and I hope that you will continue and hear some of the rest of the
Yes, I'll be continuing, Dr. Abla, for next 10 or 15 minutes, and thank you very much. And best of luck.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. There is no definition for adaptability, which is actually very interesting. If you don't define something, then how can you possibly protect it or go after it? To get out of the generality of the access to finance and the infamous $100 billion, which seems to be so bad that nobody wants to talk about its specifics or getting out of it. I mean, it's just bad. It's there and it's just bad, but okay. So I'm going to ask the other five, please, if any one of them wants to comment more on the specifics of the Green Fund. If you want to add something, add, not big talk, so that we can move on to our next theme, given the time. Is any one of you interested to say a bit more about it? I'm just, it's asking, so just raise your hand in the air. Harry, okay, go ahead, Harry.
Yes, I don't know how I'm going to follow on after Her Excellency's sharing, but I shall try. I mean, asking specifically about the Green Climate Fund. I mean, first of all, 100 billion sounds like a lot, but for climate change mitigation alone, for the next 3 decades, we need 100 to 150 trillion. And that's for the mitigation side alone. So even that amount is challenging, even if it was fully deployed year on year. I think there were certain aspects of, aspects of governance that Green Climate Fund continues to look at. But what I wanted to mention were actually specific examples in the hope that this is helpful. Also, those who are, I'm coming from the private sector, so I look at it from outside in. And as someone who has looked at blended finance and worked with institutions that look at and deploy blended finance, and Green Climate Fund is supposed to have various tools related to green related to blended finance. I mean, first of all, I think all the development funding institution had issues dealing with due diligence due to COVID. This has been a major issue because in the most frontier emerging markets, it is important to actually do the on-the-ground due diligence. So, you know, we should just be cognizant of that. Deploying funding in the most, you know, needy markets has not necessarily been easy when it comes to the climate side. Of course, there's been significant deployment on the social side. Now, adaptation financing side, notoriously difficult. And therefore, that's why when it comes to adaptation and green climate finance, indeed, there is a lot more that goes towards the public sector operations rather than the private sector operations, and rightly so. And we have seen some funding flow, you know, grant, for example, and I can give best examples from Asia, unfortunately, since I'm coming from Asia. So Laos, for example, to build resilience through ecosystem-based solutions to prevent flooding. They went through UNEP, you know, UN Environmental Program as accredited entity. By the way, for those who are looking to raise financing through GCF, there are about 113 accredited entities. Getting that accredited entity status can be done by anyone, but it is can be a very long process. And therefore, you would have thought that there would be hundreds and thousands, but unfortunately, that's why perhaps there's only 113 that have the ability to tap into that capital on behalf of projects or entities. But nevertheless, this Laos project that I mentioned did tap into it. Like Her Excellency mentioned, it had to prove that there were 75,000 most vulnerable people. Of course, there are estimates and statistics that you need to pull together to to pull that together, and specifically to help implement ecosystem solutions to reduce flooding. Now, I think one of the ways that one can increase the chances of doing this is if the request for funding specifically doesn't only look at climate change mitigation or adaptation, so like what was already being mentioned, the co-benefits, whether that be from environmental perspective, environmental objective perspective, or social perspective. You know, this particular grant had capacity building because resilience projects are notoriously difficult to maintain if either the public sector or the community does not know how to maintain it. So, you know, it specifically had really built-in capacity building aspect to the whole program. And, you know, just this concept of additionality, you know, when you're applying for the funding, one would love to see like additionality on every single aspect, a new company coming to apply for the first time, a new project, new everything. But guess what? The more new it is, the less track record there is, the more due diligence that's required. And essentially, the longer it is going to be to try to tap into that funding. So I think it's also a good idea to not necessarily look at all the new aspects and to have a very good accreditation partner who has a track record in tapping into the funds already. I do know of other entities that managed to tap the funding in record times, you know, within months. And what that went down to, and there's one company that I do know, for example, the Green Guarantee Company, the management team that formed the Green Guarantee Company, it's a platform that's going to be guaranteeing debt, essentially, and bonds and bring it to investment grade levels. The team that was put together did have good track record. And by the way, the debt guarantee can only be for climate change adaptation mitigation, first and foremost, projects related to that in developing countries. But with the right parties and right mentorship, if you'd like, there was a program that was put together in time for COP26, where there were some consultants involved there. So a little bit like what you call this accelerator program to really help forward the concept. So there was technical assistance, etc. With all of those sort of key components put down, I think the chances of being able to tap into that funding is going to be way greater. And just final point on this, as I mentioned for GCF in particular, the component, as I've understood, that looks at the public financing is quite a larger operation than the private side. If you really want to leverage as catalytic capital provision by GCF, every single channel of capital available, including the public side, then not only GCF, but all other blended finance facilities, it really would be great to scale up the contributions as catalytic capital that blended finance facilities can make to mobilize the private sector.
We'll talk about the blended finance later, okay? I'm going to ask you to say more about that later. For now, let us just stick to what we have here. Thank you so much, Herry, great comments. It's throwing more in than just the climate will make the due diligence actually easier and a lot faster, hopefully, to deal with. So it's a good solution.